Well, good evening. This is Truth Seeker here, and I have some more information I think that would be kind of interesting to review. I'm particularly interested in the period of the Bible student movement as it transitioned into the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's always been an intriguing subject to me. And I put together some information. Now, there's an awful lot of historical information on JW Facts. You have a lot of the yearbooks going back to the first year that they published them, which was 1927, which covered the fiscal year 1926. And you have all of the old watchtowers going back to 1879, when the first issue came out. I believe it was in August of 1879. And Golden Age and a lot of other historical documents, as well as figures and spreadsheets, and you can do your own statistics. One thing that I noticed, and I'm going to be trying something on this that I've never done before, but I'm going to try a feature of this filming Movavi that I use to do screen capture so that we can take a look at some of the analysis that I've done. But we know, anybody who knows a little about the Watchtower history knows that Judge Rutherford, Joseph F. Rutherford, he liked to be known as Judge Rutherford because he was a circuit court judge for a while, and he tried a couple of cases, and so this guy had a huge ego, and he liked to magnify himself. He was delusional. I think he had not only psychopathy, but grandiose delusional disorder. Certainly one thing that he was not a fan of was Russell and the reverence, the deification that the Bible students placed on Russell. They even called him a biblical figure, the wise and faithful servant, using the King James Version. I guess today's Watchtower Bible, the New World Translation, uses the faithful and discreet slave. Less, again, this is one of my gripes. I think that the New World Translation takes the King James, the beauty of the language of the King James, and just puts it in as plain and ugly an English form of English as possible. So anyway, that's just a personal gripe of mine. But anyway, it's the same thing, the faithful and discreet, the wise and faithful servant and the faithful and discreet slave. That's the same scripture from Matthew. And Bible students thought that Russell was the wise and faithful servant. It's on his tombstone. So if you look at his grave, you'll see, I don't know if the wise and faithful servant is, but I know the Laodicean messenger is, and they believed for certain that he was the last of the messengers from the second chapter of Revelation, where it talks about the messenger, Thyatira and Cyrus and Philadelphia and all those, and Laodicea is the last messenger, and to the churches. And so they had Russell being that, being foretold in the scriptures. And if somebody is foretold in the scriptures, they're going to certainly hold a special place if they've been foretold thousands of years in advance by God in His special book. You can see a little of the skepticism in my look there, but anyway, Rutherford hated that. He hated it. And that's why you don't have birthdays. That's why you don't have certain holidays, because he did not like the idea of creature worship. And that's something. If you look in Alexander Hugh Macmillan's book, Faith on the March, published in 1957, they talk about their experience in the Atlanta Penitentiary, where all of the directors of the Watchtower had been imprisoned for sedition against the government in World War I. They were trumped up charges, and yes, the United States government was wrong for jailing them. But if they only had known, they were just some whack religion and really harmless. But there was such a patriotic fervor, they didn't want to chance any danger that people might start rallying up against the government. It was kind of a controversial war anyway, because a lot of people wanted to stay out of that war, and Wilson had to jump through hoops to get into that war. But anyway, that's all side history. Rutherford Macmillan explains in his book that Rutherford detested creature worship, and as he got to be more of a drunk, more nasty in his demeanor over the years, he tolerated this idea of creature worship all the more, and stood up more for the vindication of Jehovah's name. And we're fighting this war against the Satan's minions and the churches and religion's a snare and a racket and all that stuff. But Rutherford didn't stand up to his opposition very well. He wasn't a very kind victor. He was one of these types of guys that if he won, he destroyed you. He absolutely destroyed you. He wouldn't just win a war. He'd just wipe you out, extinguish. If he was a government leader, he would just wipe out the opposition altogether. So that's the kind of a person he was, and that's how he was with any of the directors that there were 4 directors that opposed him, and he made sure that he quashed any kind of rebelliousness against his authority, and he was better at it than the directors were. Let's just put it that way. He was he didn't have this conscientious, let's say, streak in his character where he just didn't mind destroying others if he had the chance. So anyway, he called it harvest siftings, and they got into a little battle writing of papers to affect to try and win over the Bible students. The directors wrote papers, and Rutherford countered with harvest siftings, and I think there were a couple of these papers that he wrote called harvest siftings before he went to jail. That I guess anybody who opposed him and his agenda, when he got rid of them, they were being sifted by Jehovah. That's really what it amounted to, and that's what he did down through the 20s. Now, oddly enough, after the First World War, and the directors were released from jail, the movement kind of recouped pretty quickly. They gathered together. They recouped and retrenched, and really put their support behind Rutherford because of the experience that he went through, being jailed and persecuted, and many of the young men that were Bible students were also persecuted. I knew a number who were drafted and went to jail during World War One. I wasn't there, of course, but they were elderly, and they would, like Russell Pollock, went to jail. He was, if you look in the 1927 through 28 Pilgrims list in the yearbooks, you'll see Pollock's name. It's G.R. Pollock. He became a Bible student after he left the Watchtower, and he left he didn't become a Jehovah's Witness, and he used to talk to us young people about conscientious objection. And so every year he was a main figure in the Bible students movement when I was growing up, and every year he would tell us his experience about having gone to jail at the age of 18 for not serving in World War I. And quite a few young brethren of that era did go to jail. And Rutherford was sort of the example, I guess. But shortly after World War I, the movement recouped. Rutherford held a couple of momentous conventions. I believe in 1919 at Cedar Point there was a big convention. And then in 1920, I think there was a major Cedar Point convention where Rutherford had the famous banners across that emphasized about witnessing. I think what was that? It slips my mind right now. I'm sorry about that, but it really focused on witnessing and their obligation to witness to the kingdom, and so that became a very, very important element in Bible student teachings, and the Bible student movement grew. And so now here I'm going to, at this point, try and show some figures. Okay. We're going to start again. I had screwed up before with the mic being off. Now, what we're going to look at is some data that I put together. And this first chart that we look at here is, I'm going to see if I can do full screen. Well, I'm not sure I can do that. anyway, this chart here, so I'm sorry about that, is memorial attendance from 1917 to 1935. You could see that after the Cedar Point Convention, the first two figures here, 1917, the memorial attendance was 21,000. 1919, it was 18,000. There was a real impact on the movement after Rutherford took office as president. There were some splits, and many, I guess at that time, I heard 1 in 7 Bible students left the movement at the time Rutherford took the presidency. So it makes sense that there's a decline here. But then at the Cedar Point Convention, I believe it was the 1920 convention, or 21, where he had the famous advertise the king and his kingdom, and he really put the pressure on the movement to witness. Witnessing was the sole emphasis of the movement. Now, Russell believed in character development, and that was the focus was on making it to the 144,000, whereas Rutherford was all about growing the movement, and so his emphasis was to get as many members to be as loyal to him and the Watchtower as possible. And he did this through several devices. There was the channel concept and New Light, although that really did lose a number of Bible students. The growth during this period was rather dramatic, and I think that had largely to do with the prediction he made that 1925 would be the year that the kingdom would begin, and he based that on the number of jubilees from the time of Adam to the then present time. And he had it conveniently end on 1925. So they believe that's when the kingdom would begin, and when the ancient worthies would come to rule in Israel, and so on. The number didn't decline much in 1926, 89,000, because he said 1925 or thereabouts. But after 1926, you could see a tremendous drop. And it's actually a more dramatic view in this chart. Now, the lighter bars here is synthetic data that I created synthetically. So it's not real data, but it's based on an interpolation of real data points. The darker bars are actual data, and the period of time that we're looking at is between 1917 and 1943. Here you can see this rather dramatic drop from 1926 to 1928, from roughly 90,000 to 17,000. That's over a drop of just about 70,000 people. And the blue bars I created, these are the partakers of the memorial, and the red bars are attendees. Now, the data from the 1920s, I presume, is attendance data. They didn't necessarily give the partaking, and so I based off of 1935 the ratio between those that were partakers and those that attended from 1935. I just applied back to the 20s, assuming that 1935 probably was the closest representation we might have to the 20s. So this again is just a guesstimate, but I would assume that if we had 89,000 attending the memorial, we had less actually partaking of it, but not too much less. Like in 1935, we have 71,000 in attendance and almost 54,000 partakers. Now you can see that as time progresses into the 1940s, that this gap between partakers in 1943 it's 12,000, and the number attending is 88,000. So by 1943, the movement had pretty much recouped to the original numbers in Watchtower, but it was a different organization, because whereas in previous years the majority of individuals were partakers of the memorial as Bible students, as Jehovah's Witnesses, the majority were what they call Jonadabs, or those that would make it into the 1,000 years but not be part of the 144,000. That number diminished to about 12,000, and it remained around 12,000 for another 30 or 40 years. So something rather dramatic happened right here. This is where the nature of the movement changed, and it's quite interesting when you look at the yearbook data. Now we'll take a look if I can get us over. That's the 1927 yearbook. Now, what we have here, I downloaded the 1927 yearbook. You can see that. This is the first yearbook that Watchtower published. And Rutherford was president, Wise was vice president, and Van Amberger was the treasurer. And they published a list in this book called the Pilgrim Speakers List. And these were speakers, influential speakers, that were approved by the Watchtower Society and represented the society across the United States. And they were called Pilgrim Speakers. This was a name that Russell had given to these speakers, such as Cole Porters and so on. The Cole Porters are no longer Cole Porters. They what do they call those? I forget what they call them now in the society, but they have publishers. Publishers would be the laity, and well, anyway, I'm drawing a blank right now. It's just, but you can see the names here in this list, and this is from 1926. These individuals represented. These were speakers that represented the Watchtower Society, and here you can see the report on Cole Porters and so on. Cole Porters, they were the full-time service doing the door-to-door sales of the books. Now, I copied this list, and I copied the list from 1931. Okay, this list is from 1931. Now, I compared the names. This is after that drop-off. And 1920, this is the 31 yearbook, and the other was 1927. And so it represented the year 1926, before that precipitous drop-off took place, okay? And so 1930 would be after that precipitous drop-off, and just a year before Rutherford changed the name of the organization to Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, I copied the names from both lists, one from 1930s, from 1930, and the other from 1926. And I compared the names. And you would think that, if there was stability in the movement, that the majority of the names would remain the same. But what you find are that when I compared the names in the two lists between 1926 and 1930, there's a tremendous change. The names that I have in green, now this left-hand list is 1930, the right-hand list is 1926. The names, I have brown, light brown here, and these are in red. These are names that don't correspond to one another, okay? This is C.S. Anderson, that's H. Anderson, okay? The green are where the names are the same for the two different years, 26 and 1930. And as you go down the list, you can see that there are more names that are different than there are the same. And when I did the final count, it was striking. It turned out that there were, for 1926, in total, 253 names in the Pilgrims list. In 1930, it had dropped to 234. So we go from 253 to 234, which is a 7.5% drop in the total number of names in the list. But what's more striking is this, that in the 1926 list, 152 names don't show in the 1930 list. Only 101 names were the same. So 152 names were dropped from the 1926 list, and 133 names replaced them. Now that's a significant change. And some of the names that replaced them were names like Swingle, Grant Suter, Lyman Swingle, who both of these became very influential, powerful men in the society later on in the 1950s and 60s. And they got their start in around 1930. So you can see that there really is a change in the character of the society right there in the names of the individuals who were the official representing speakers for the Watchtower Society. And when I calculated from 1926, this 152 names that were dropped from the list, that represents a loss of 60% of the names from that 1926 list were lost from that list forever. So that, for example, this fellow here, W.N. Woodworth, I knew him. he left the Watchtower Society in 1928. Actually, was disfellowshipped by Rutherford himself. Worked for WBBR, ran a program he called Frank and Ernest, and Rutherford didn't like the fact that Woodworth was reluctant to preach any of the new light from the channel, and so Rutherford said, either I write the scripts or you're out, and Woodworth left. Christian Zeno was a very influential Bible student in the 1930s who left the society in 1928. And all of these names in brown are Bible students that no longer associated with the society. Robert Seclemian, he was a very influential Bible student. Walter Sargent was very influential. Rice, I'm related to the Rices. My dad's older sister married into the Rice family. G.R. Pollock, that was Russell Pollock. He was very instrumental in the establishment of the Dawn, along with Norman Woodworth. And so we see, and Marchant, Brother Marchant, was a very influential Bible student. George Kendall. I knew all of these individuals, and they were on the list with people like Knorr and Franz and Rutherford and Macmillan. And all of these guys got purged from that list and replaced with people whose names are in red, like Grant Suter and Lyman Swingle, and all of these other names in red were the replacements for the people who were kicked off in the brown here on the 1926. So there was a major purge, 60%. Now, William Schnell, the author of the book 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, estimated that 75% of the original Bible students movement had left the Bible students and became disenfranchised from the Watchtower Society by the late 1920s, I think 1928 in particular. 75%. And so you could see here that this corresponds very closely to that 75%. The Pilgrim Speakers list had almost a wholesale changeover when you talk about 60%. And so that's a phenomenal. That's actually a coup de grace. It's a major coup here that took place with Rutherford, and this was all by design. I don't believe that he did this by accident or that this was something that just happened. This was something that Rutherford had thought about for a long time, because he had a difficult time with anybody who revered Charles Russell. Russell was practically deified by the Bible students in Russell's time while Russell was alive, and that reverence only grew, and that deification and reverence almost grew to the point of worshiping. And in Rutherford's eyes, it was called creature worship, and he wanted to expel that from the movement. And so he did this quote-unquote sifting, and this is what this result is here, this 60% decline. Now, when we go back to the other sheet, we could see that at its peak, the Bible Students Movement was around 90,000 in 1925. When the purge took place, the vast majority of the original movement was gone by 1928. The memorial attendance number was below 20,000. It was 17,000. So we had a decline of over 70,000 individuals. And if you talk about memorial partakers and if I have any validity to the relative proportion, we're talking about 75,000 memorial partakers versus about 15,000. So that's about a drop of about 50,000 memorial partakers. Now, something very interesting that my brother had found was in the, see if I can, oh, I know where it is. Okay, right there. Now, I have to give my brother credit for this. He found this online. I had mentioned to you that Norman Woodworth had gone on, after leaving the Watchtower Society, he had gone on to form the Dawn Bible Students. And under the Dawn, they published a magazine called the Dawn Magazine in honor of the Millennium Dawn, which is the original name for the studies in the Scriptures. The Dawn also published the studies in the Scriptures, which went out of print. The Watchtower stopped printing the studies in the Scriptures in 1927. You can see the timing was all right around 1927 and 28. That drop off, that precipitous change, the wholesale purge of pilgrim speakers, the stopping of the printing of the studies in the Scriptures, which were authored by Russell. And from that point on, he was ready to pull the trigger on changing the name of the movement, which he did in 1931. He called them the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he had essentially no resistance to that, because everybody that remained was loyal to the Watchtower at that point. But this left an awful lot of disenfranchised Bible students during the 1930s and 40s. And in fact, a number of people, like my family and others that I knew, remained with the Watchtower Society through the 30s before they finally left. They were hoping that eventually that the Lord would fix the problems that were happening with the Watchtower, and the Lord saw to it that they were not fixed. But this document here that I pulled up is a court case that was initiated in 1946, actually, a year after the Dawn moved out of Brooklyn to the city or borough of East Rutherford in New Jersey, across the river from New York City. And the town of East Rutherford wanted to collect property taxes from the Dawn, and the Dawn had believed that it was a tax-exempt organization, and they entered into a several-year disagreement starting in 1946 over $27,000 in back taxes paid, what the town believed was owed. And as part of the court proceedings, the judge asked Norman Woodworth, who headed the Dawn up, what the Dawn Bible students were about, and he gives this description. The purpose of the association is to spread the religious beliefs of the Bible as interpreted by the late Charles T. Russell through media and of pamphlets, study groups, and radio broadcasting, which is the Frank and Ernest that I had mentioned earlier, which targeted thousands of and reached thousands of disenfranchised Bible students. And furtherance of its aims, it maintained on the premises in East Rutherford a printing plant and in the same building, and it housed and fed many of its workers, some volunteers and others receiving wages. And during the year 1946, the association published upwards of 100,000 copies of religious pamphlets. You see, the Dawn was essentially a replication of the Watchtower Society, but by the Bible students that weren't disenfranchised from the Watchtower. It never reached the magnitude of the Watchtower. Never. It just didn't have the momentum and power, and Bible students again just didn't trust any kind of centralized organization where control could occur like what happened under Rutherford. So the Dawn never had the traction that the Watchtower had, but it certainly played a critical role in regathering the movement. And so it talks about how much it published, and then it says in 1946 it held 1,681 meetings attended by 56,000 persons. None, however, on the East Rutherford property. Now, these 56,000 persons were people throughout the United States and Canada that were reorganized. They heard the message from the Frank and Ernest radio broadcast and recognized the Dawn as being supportive of Charles Russell, and contacted the Dawn, and the Dawn would send representatives out and organize meetings and ecclesias, which are congregations, throughout the United States. So this holds together very well with Schnell's numbers. This 56,000 persons is about the difference that we see at the time when the purge took place, when that sudden drop took place in the 1920s, right here, this precipitous drop right here. And you could see that the Dawn did a fairly good job of regrouping the Bible students by having collected some 56,000 persons. And so most of the Bible students had reformed again under the Dawn. The Dawn never really controlled any classes, any Bible student ecclesias. It was always a service organization. It was like what the Watchtower used to be before Rutherford used it as a means of controlling a movement. And the Dawn and the Bible students movement really reached their peak in the 1940s, 1950s, and began a slow, long decline through the 60s and 1970s as the original Bible students started dying away in the 1970s. They were all my grandparents' age and some older. And so through the 1960s, there were a lot of deaths. As a kid, I went to a lot of funerals. But the Bible students never did quite the amount of witness work that the Watchtower did, and so there was never any real external growth. Every so often, some people from the Jehovah's Witnesses would join the Bible students, but that was infrequently and not enough to maintain the organization. Bible students have basically they're born-ins. Most of the Bible students today are born-ins, and they go back many generations. I'm related to quite a few of these Bible students today. There's a general convention. About 400 meet at the general convention. There may be 2,000 or so Bible students in the United States. No one's ever taken a count, but I just kind of estimate that that's probably where it is, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 now. And it's on rapid decline. But this idea that Watchtower wants their followers to think that it was a smooth, harmonious transition from Bible students into morphing into the Jehovah's Witnesses as the movement matured. That's erroneous. That is a completely erroneous idea. And that's all shown by this data, which is very clear that there was a significant purge that took place in the late 1920s. I think if you look through some of these yearbooks later on in the 30s, like 1932, I think Rutherford calls what happened a harvest sifting or a sifting. He does go into some detail in the 1932 yearbook to explain the new name, and part of it was in order to distinguish between other groups that called themselves Bible students, and he didn't want anybody confusing people from the Watchtower Society with other Bible students. There were Standfasters, there were the Pastoral Bible Institute, there were the Layman's Home Missionary, and by the early 30s there was the Dawn Bible Students. And so there were a number of Bible student groups that came into existence between 1917 and 1932, and Rutherford didn't want anybody confusing his group from them, and they weren't so big at that time. So he had to do an awful lot of rebuilding in order to get the kind of organization that he wanted, and he did a lot of doctrinal changes during the 1930s. That allowed for a relatively rapid regrowth of the movement. Again, going back to this, you could see that by 1943, 1942, the movement had pretty well recouped in numbers, although the mix was quite a bit different. You had 12,000 partaking of memorial versus 88,000 who were not, and so you had a movement that was about as big as in the mid-20s, but it was an entirely different type of movement, and it was because Rutherford staged a coup and essentially started a new movement in 1931. It is wrong to call the Bible students Jehovah's Witnesses because Bible students were never Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, some Jehovah's Witnesses had been Bible students, but the vast majority of the Bible students continued being Bible students, and the movement has just gradually phased out over the years. So, I don't know if there's anything more I want to say. I think that this is interesting. I think it's important for people, the Jehovah's Witnesses in particular, to know what the truth is. It's right there. You can see it for yourself in these books. You can do the exact study I did and see that what I say is correct. And the history that the Watchtower Society and the governing body gives you today is just flat out wrong. It's a lie. It's a completely different thing. And I'm impartial. I'm an atheist. I don't have any partiality to the Bible students, even though I was born in it. My family were Jehovah's Witnesses for 6 years. I recently discovered, and so I don't have any partiality to either group. I don't like the fact that the Watchtower is a high control group, and I believe the Bible students are not a heck of a lot better. They're not centralized control like the Watchtower, but the culture and the behavior and the system by which they guilt trip people into staying with the Bible students and controlling their behavior with the shame and guilt and other means is not too different from the Watchtower. The only thing really different between the Watchtower is the size and the fact that you got all power vested in a small group called the governing body. So anyway, I think I'm going to stop this portion right here, and we'll finish up in a second. Well, anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I'm going to make this a quick goodbye. You can see my bookshelf back here. That is not a bookshelf of Watchtower books. Unfortunately, this is not a collection of anything but 90% of them are mathematics books. I'm a math freak. I don't even have a Bible up there. When I use a Bible, I use an online version. And a lot of it I have recalled in my head, so I can remember where, if I need to recall a Bible verse, I know where to go to, and then I pull it up on the internet and use it. You can see that it's been such a distasteful situation that for me that I don't even own a Bible anymore. And all of our Bible student books we got rid of, and I don't have anything anymore. I just everything's online anyway. So if you need something, everything is online. So I hope you found that little statistical look at that transition period in the 1920s. That had to have been planned. It was a coup, and there's no question about it. That was all planned by Rutherford and his supporters, cohort, and they did that on purpose to create a whole new movement that I think they felt that they could do better. Honestly, I think Rutherford was he had grandiose delusions, and I do think he was a psychopath. You could see that he lived quite well in Beth Sarim. If you don't know anything about that, that's an entirely different subject. But he lived very comfortably in Beth Sarim, where the volunteer work for the Bethel were living in pretty tough situations. And that leads to the Olin Moyle letter. And interestingly enough, Olin's daughter-in-law was a friend of my mother's, Edna Moyle. She was the wife of Peter Moyle, the son, the only child of Olin Moyle. And if you don't know who Olin Moyle is, and you're a Jehovah's Witness, look up Olin Moyle and Wikipedia. There's an article about him and the letter that he wrote. He was a top-notch lawyer, despite the fact that he was a good lawyer, Rutherford booted him, disfellowshipped him rather rapidly because Rutherford was criticized by Moyle for the conditions and the disparity between living conditions between Rutherford, who had this mansion and farm out in San Diego with two 16-cylinder Cadillacs, and living the high life, and bullying people and pushing people around and using foul language and getting drunk. I heard stories about how hard it was sometimes to get Rutherford to the podium because they were afraid that he would fall down, lose his balance because he had too much to drink. He imbibed too much, and being the mean old bastard that he was, he died a nasty death with colon cancer in 1942. So I'm not a Rutherford fan. I think he was a very, very nasty person. So anyway, this is Truth Seekers saying so long, and I hope you enjoyed this.